When I first began researching the mass removal of bells during World War I assumed the explanation would be straightforward. War requires metal, bells are bronze, governments confiscated them. That's the story repeated in textbooks. But the deeper I went into the records, the faster that explanation began to collapse. Because what disappeared in 1914 wasn't just metal, it was infrastructure. For centuries, bells regulated daily life. They marked time before clocks were common. They coordinated work, warnings, gatherings, and emergencies. Entire towns were synchronized by sound. So when the bells were removed, communities didn't just lose objects, they lost a system. What immediately stood out was how uniform the removals were. Across Europe, even across enemy nations, the same orders appeared at the same time. France, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Italy, different governments, different languages, identical action. Bells were lowered carefully, documented, transported intact. That alone was strange, because if urgency was the goal, preservation makes no sense. Then came the first anomaly. The bells weren't melted immediately. Instead, they were stored. As I combed through municipal archives and wartime photographs, I kept finding the same images repeated across regions. Rows of bells, stacked in open fields, lined up beside rail lines, catalogued and numbered. These were not scrap piles, they were organized inventories. If the goal was to turn bells into weapons, why pause the process? Why transport them long distances, only to leave them untouched? And then comes the silence in the record. After the war, Europe rebuilt aggressively. Churches were restored, monuments reconstructed, civic symbols returned, but the bells did not. There are no comprehensive replacement programs, no public audits, no explanations for why entire regions remained silent. The documentation simply ends, and that absence became impossible to ignore. Because governments track metal, they track wartime resources, they track losses. Yet in this case, the story stops halfway through. Bells are removed, bells are stored, and then nothing. No confirmation of melting, no matching foundry outputs, no final accounting. Which leads to the question that started this investigation. If this was only about metal, why were the bells never returned? In the next episode, I'll show you the evidence that made this question unavoidable. Photographs that survived, storage fields that were documented, and records that reveal the problem was never what was written, but what was missing. Because once you see how these bells were handled, it becomes clear they were never treated like scrap at all. When I moved beyond official explanations and into physical evidence, the story shifted again. Because written records can be incomplete, photographs are harder to dismiss. The first image I found came from a regional archive in Central Europe. It showed an open field, flat land, rail lines nearby, and stretching across the frame were bells. Not one or two, dozens, then hundreds, stacked carefully on wooden supports, arranged in rows, each bell upright, undamaged. This wasn't chaos, it was storage. As I kept searching, the same scenes appeared again and again. Different countries, different years, same layout, bell fields. Some were photographed beside rail yards, others near military depots, a few near foundries, but never inside them. And that distinction matters, because scrap metal doesn't get stored like this. Scrap is piled, broken, sorted by weight. These bells were intact. More than that, many still bore identification marks, catalogue numbers, town names, foundry stamps. In several photographs, the markings are clearly visible, which means someone intended to keep track of them. That realization forced me to stop assuming destruction was the goal, because you don't catalogue something you're about to erase. I began cross-referencing these images with municipal inventories. Many towns kept pre-war bell registries, weights, dimensions, casting dates. Those registries confirmed the removals. But when I followed the trail forward, something broke. There were no matching foundry receipts, no records of alloy breakdown, no spike in bronze output corresponding to the number of bells removed. Wartime production logs list shells, casings, artillery components, but not bells, and not in the quantities that should exist if these fields were processed. In some regions, hundreds of bells vanished from records entirely, not destroyed, not repurposed, just absent. What makes this more unsettling is the effort involved. These bells were massive. Some weighed several tons. Moving them required cranes, rail cars, dozens of workers. That level of coordination doesn't happen accidentally. So why go through all that effort, only to stop? Official historians often explain this away as wartime confusion, but confusion doesn't create patterns. And these patterns were precise. Same handling methods, same storage layouts, same lack of follow-through, across borders, across years, across political systems. The more records I checked, the clearer the issue became. The problem wasn't that the bells were taken. The problem was that their story ends too early. Because destruction leaves evidence, and silence at this scale does not happen by accident. In the next episode, I'll examine what made these bells different in the first place. Not as religious objects, not as symbols, but as instruments. Because once you understand how these bells were designed to function, the reason they were stored, not destroyed, begins to make disturbing sense. By the time I reached this stage of the research, the question had changed. It was no longer why the bells were taken. It was why these bells mattered enough to be removed carefully. Because once you examine the bells themselves, not as religious symbols, but as engineered objects, another layer appears. Bells are not simple. They are precision instruments. Every large bell is tuned, not just to a single note, but to a complex harmonic profile, a fundamental tone, overtones, subharmonics. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, bell casting was treated as applied science. Foundry records describe exact ratios, wall thickness variations measured in millimeters, profiles adjusted to control vibration decay. This wasn't folklore, it was engineering. What struck me most was consistency. Across Europe, bells from entirely different regions share similar proportions, similar tonal ranges, similar mass to diameter ratios. That doesn't happen by accident. It suggests a shared design logic. Then I began looking at placement. Bells were not positioned randomly in towns. They were elevated, centered, aligned with open space. Bell towers were often the highest non-defensive structures in a settlement, placed to maximize range, placed to overlap with neighboring towers. When mapped, many of these towers form repeating distance patterns, not perfect grids, but rhythmic spacing, as if coverage mattered. Historical accounts describe bells rung at specific times, not just for worship, but for daily regulation, work cycles, market openings, warnings, weather changes, even illness. In several regions, records mention bells rung during outbreaks, during storms, during periods described as bad air. That phrase appears again and again. Bad air. Before germ theory, people understood environment through sensation, smell, sound, pressure, and bells were believed to influence that environment. Today, that idea is dismissed as superstition, But modern science complicates that dismissal. Sound is mechanical energy. Vibration propagates through air, stone, water, and the human body. Low-frequency resonance can travel kilometers. It can influence materials. It can affect biological systems. That's not speculation, that's physics. Large bronze bells produce powerful, sustained vibrations, especially when rung repeatedly, especially when tuned in relation to one another. Which brings us back to the removals, because the bells targeted in 1914 were not random. Large bells, old bells, deep-toned bells. Smaller bells were often left behind. Decorative bells remained. Ceremonial bells survived, but the largest, most resonant instruments were prioritized. That detail changes everything. If this were about metal alone, weight would matter, but so would speed. Melting on site would be efficient. Instead, these bells were transported intact, stored, catalogued, almost as if someone didn't want them damaged, almost as if their form mattered as much as their material. And once you consider bells as infrastructure, as part of a larger acoustic system, the logic shifts. Removing them would do more than silence churches. It would dismantle a network that regulated time, coordinated communities, possibly interacted with environment in ways no longer understood. And once that network was gone, it couldn't be rebuilt easily, because tuning knowledge fades, foundries close, craft becomes ritual instead of science. By the early 20th century, bell making had changed. Bells became symbolic again, not systemic, which raises a disturbing possibility. What if the bells weren't destroyed because they were obsolete, but because they still worked? In the next episode, I'll follow what happened after the removals, how cities changed once the bells were gone, how silence replaced rhythm, and why the world that followed looks very different from the one that came before. When the bells disappeared, the change wasn't immediate. There were no public announcements, no declarations that something essential had been removed. Life continued, but the rhythm was gone. As I began comparing towns before and after 1914, a subtle but consistent shift emerged. Pre-war photographs show cities organized around sound. Bell towers dominate skylines. Open squares radiate outward from them. Daily life appears synchronized. After the war, those same towers remain, but they are empty, silent. In many cases, the towers weren't rebuilt. They weren't redesigned. They were simply left hollow. Municipal records from the 1920s reveal something strange. Cities begin installing mechanical clocks, sirens, factory whistles, artificial signals. Where bells once regulated communal life organically, these new systems impose time externally. Time becomes fragmented. Work hours extend. Night shifts expand. Sound shifts from harmonic to abrasive. This wasn't just cultural, it was physiological. Communities that had lived for centuries with regular low-frequency resonance suddenly lost it. No transition period, no adjustment. Silence replaced vibration. At the same time, reports of modern problems begin to rise in urban records. Sleep disturbances, anxiety, disorientation, social unrest. None of this is attributed to bells, of course, but the timing aligns. Another pattern emerges when looking at architecture. Post-1914 renovations often seal bell chambers. Access ladders are removed. Open arches are bricked in. Why seal empty spaces? Why not simply leave them? Unless what mattered wasn't the bell, but the absence of sound. Then there is the issue of replacement. After World War I, many cultural artifacts were restored, statues returned, libraries rebuilt, paintings recovered. But bells, entire regions never received replacements. In some towns, bells were promised, funds were allocated, and then nothing. Decades pass, silence remains. I found correspondence from local councils requesting new bells well into the 1930s. The replies are vague, delayed, non-committal, as if no one wanted to reopen the subject. And then there's the industrial shift. Once bells were gone, coal becomes dominant. Electric grids expand. Centralized power replaces local systems. Sound, once communal and environmental, becomes mechanical and private. Headphones, radios, broadcasts. The shared sonic environment dissolves. At this point in the research, coincidence becomes hard to maintain. The removal of bells aligns with centralized timekeeping, industrial labor expansion, loss of communal rhythms, increased environmental noise, decline of harmonic soundscapes. None of this proves intent on its own, but together, it suggests something deeper than wartime necessity. The world after 1914 isn't just louder, it's harsher, more fragmented, less synchronized with itself. Which brings us to the final and most uncomfortable question. Was the silence an accident, or was it the point? In the final episode, I'll examine why this system was never restored, why modern science avoided it, why history reframed it as superstition, and why, a century later, we're only beginning to rediscover what was lost when the bells went quiet. By the time I reached the end of this research, one fact was impossible to ignore. Nothing replaced the bells. Not truly. Technology advanced, cities modernized, power grids expanded. But the system the bells belonged to was never restored, and that absence is the final clue. Because societies rebuild what they value. Roads are rebuilt, bridges are rebuilt, churches are rebuilt. Even symbols are restored when they matter enough. But a functional system, one that once shaped daily life across continents, was allowed to vanish without resistance. Modern explanations frame bells as cultural artifacts, ritual objects, historical curiosities. That framing is convenient, because once something is labeled symbolic, its removal no longer requires justification. But the historical record tells a different story. Bells were once treated as infrastructure. Their placement was deliberate, their tuning precise, their coverage overlapping. They formed networks, not electrical, not digital, acoustic. And acoustic systems are difficult to control. They don't require fuel. They don't rely on centralized distribution. They don't belong to corporations. They belong to place. That may explain why modern science avoided them. Early 20th century research into resonance, vibration, and environmental sound exists, but it fragments quickly. What was once holistic becomes compartmentalized. Sound becomes entertainment. Noise becomes byproduct. Frequency becomes abstract. The idea that sound could structure environment or health quietly disappears. Not disproven, just forgotten, yet traces remain. In modern studies of low-frequency vibration, in sound therapy, in architectural acoustics, in biological resonance research, each field touches part of the same truth. That vibration affects matter, that frequency influences systems, that harmony is not metaphor, it is mechanism. The bells of the old world were not primitive versions of modern tools. They were something else entirely. A technology rooted in material, geometry, and environment. One that didn't scale well under centralized control, which may be why it was allowed to die, or encouraged to. When the bells were taken, something subtle but fundamental changed. Communities lost a shared rhythm. Cities lost an invisible layer of order. The world grew louder, but less coherent, and silence became normal. Today we stand in empty towers. We walk past sealed arches. We photograph relics without asking why they were there in the first place. But once you see the pattern, it's difficult to unsee. The bells were not removed because they were outdated. They were removed because they belonged to a system that no longer fit the world being built. And that raises the final question. If an entire layer of technology could be erased once, what else are we standing inside without realizing it? Because history doesn't always destroy what it replaces. Sometimes, it just makes sure we forget how it worked.